Close your eyes and imagine this. You're standing in a muddy field somewhere in the Pacific, 1943. The air is thick, humid, suffocating. Yesterday, this was just jungles and dirt. But today, as far as your eyes can see, there are rows upon rows of curved metal structures stretching to the horizon. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, each one identical, each one gleaming dully in the tropical sun. It looks like an alien city dropped from the sky, but it's not alien. It's American. And it appeared almost overnight. This is what winning a world war actually looked like. Not just tanks rolling through streets, or planes screaming through the sky. It looked like this. Fields of steel half-moons that nobody talks about, nobody remembers. But without them, the war might have gone very differently. Here's something that'll blow your mind. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States manufactured more than 100,000 of these structures. 100,000. That's an entire portable civilization, boxed up and shipped to every corner of the planet. And each one could go from a crate to a complete building in less than 24 hours. They called them Quonset Huts. And if you've never heard of them, you're not alone. But here's what you need to understand. These weren't just buildings. They were the answer to a question that could have crippled the entire American war effort. How do you house millions of men on the move across a planet that's actively trying to kill them? The answer was brilliantly simple. You build a building that isn't really a building at all. You make it out of steel, arch it like a tunnel, pack it flat, and send it anywhere. Then you let 6 guys with wrenches put it together before the sun goes down. No architects, no engineers, no waiting. Just instant shelter, instant infrastructure, instant military might. This is the story of the Quonset Hut, the building that proved wars aren't just won with bullets. They're won with steel, speed, and the ability to build an entire city before your enemy even knows you've landed. Let's rewind to late 1941. December 7th, Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, America was in the war, whether they liked it or not, and the scale of what was about to happen was almost unimaginable. Millions of young men were about to be shipped to places they'd never heard of. Islands in the Pacific, with names they couldn't pronounce. Deserts in North Africa, where temperatures could kill you faster than a bullet. And here's the terrifying part. Most of these places had nothing. No buildings, no infrastructure, no shelter whatsoever. Think about that. You're sending an army of millions into hostile territory. And when they arrive, there's literally nowhere for them to sleep. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. This was a crisis that could break an entire military campaign before it even started. Because here's the brutal truth about war. You can have the best soldiers, the best weapons, the best strategy. But if your men are dying from exposure, from malaria, from exhaustion, because they're sleeping in puddles every night, you've already lost. Traditional solutions weren't going to cut it. You couldn't build wooden barracks in the middle of the Pacific. The lumber alone would take months to ship. Tents were too flimsy. They ripped in storms, flooded in rain, and offered zero protection. So the question became urgent. How do you build shelter for millions of men in dozens of locations, across thousands of miles, in weeks instead of months? This is where the United States had a secret advantage: industrial capacity. American factories knew how to mass produce. They knew how to standardize parts. They knew how to ship products flat. and assemble them on site. What if you could do that with a building? That was the breakthrough idea. Something you could manufacture like a car, package like furniture, and pop up like a tent. Something strong enough to survive a typhoon, but light enough to fit in a ship's cargo hold. And right there, in that moment of desperation, the Quonset Hut was born. The story officially starts at Quonset Point, Rhode Island. 1941. The U.S. Navy put out a call. We need a portable building, something we can ship anywhere in the world, something that can handle any climate, something cheap, durable, and idiot-proof to assemble. The British had something called a Nissen hut from World War I, but American planners said, not quite, too complicated, too many parts, we can do better. So they stripped it down to the absolute essentials. What's the strongest shape you can make with the least amount of material? An arch, a semicircle. An arched roof sheds water, deflects wind, and distributes weight evenly. And if you make it out of corrugated steel, you get even more rigidity without adding weight. The design was almost comically simple. Picture a giant tin can cut in half lengthwise, 16 feet wide, 36 feet long, about 8 feet high at the peak. Corrugated steel panels bolted together. Wooden end panels with doors and windows. That's it. The genius was in what it didn't have. No wasted material. No difficult cuts. No specialized tools required. Everything about the design screamed mass production. Every panel was identical. Every bolt hole lined up. Every hut was a clone. By the time Pearl Harbor was bombed, the Navy had already placed orders for tens of thousands of units. The design was locked. The factories were tooling up. And the Quonset Hut was about to become one of the most mass-produced items of the entire war. The original 16-foot width was cramped, so engineers quickly expanded the design to 20 feet wide, then 40 feet for special uses like mess halls and hospitals. The modular nature meant you could adapt on the fly. Hospital on Monday, storage depot on Wednesday, chapel on Sunday. The Quonset Hut could do all of it. When the military says they need 100,000 of something, most countries would laugh. But America in 1942, that was just Tuesday. The beauty of the Quonset Hut was that it fit perfectly into America's industrial wheelhouse. Factories in Rhode Island, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the Midwest all started churning out corrugated steel panels. The entire supply chain kicked into gear like a well-oiled machine. A single factory could produce hundreds of hut kits per week. Each kit contained everything you needed. Steel arch panels, numbered and ready to bolt together. Plywood end walls with pre-cut openings. Bags of bolts, nuts, and washers. The whole package weighed about 5 tons and packed flat. You could stack dozens in a single cargo hold. By 1943, production hit its peak. Factories were running 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Ships left port loaded with nothing but Quonset huts, destined for islands captured just weeks earlier. Compare that to the enemy. The Germans were building concrete bunkers that took months. The Japanese were carving tunnels by hand. Both were defensive, slow, and immobile. Meanwhile, America was building an empire of steel that could move overnight. And here's the real kicker, the speed of assembly. Once a crate hit the ground, you needed 6 to 8 regular soldiers with basic tools. A crew could have a hut standing in 1 day. By the end of the week, you could have a functioning base. What used to take months now took days. By the war's end, over 100,000 Quonset huts had been produced. 100,000 identical steel shells shipped to every theater of war, every climate on Earth. Now let's talk about what it was actually like to live in one of these things, because theory is one thing. Reality is something else entirely. Imagine you're a 20-year-old kid from Ohio. 6 months ago, you were working at a grocery store. Now you're standing on a volcanic rock island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and your new home is a corrugated steel tube that looks like it belongs in a factory, not a bedroom. Welcome to the Quonset Hut. The first thing you notice is the shape. The curved walls mean you can't stand up straight near the edges. The ceiling arches overhead, and everything echoes. When it rains, and in the Pacific it rains constantly, the sound is deafening. Each raindrop hits the metal roof like a tiny drum. Now, multiply that by 1,000, and you've got a thunderstorm that makes conversation impossible. The second thing you notice is the heat. In tropical climates, these huts became ovens by mid-morning. The steel absorbed sunlight and radiated it inward. Men would wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. Some huts had insulation installed, usually burlap or fiberboard lining. But it only helped so much. In colder climates, it was the opposite problem. The steel sucked heat right out of the space. Men in Alaska or Northern Europe would wake to frost on the inside. Walls. Stoves were installed, usually a pot-bellied unit at each end, fed with whatever fuel was available. But here's the thing. For all the discomfort, soldiers were grateful for them. Because the alternative was worse. Sleeping in a tent meant waking up in a puddle every morning. The canvas leaked. The bugs got in. At least the Quonset hut had a wooden floor, solid walls, and a roof that didn't collapse in the wind. Inside, the layout was simple. Rows of cots lined up along both sides, footlockers at the end of each bed, a central aisle down the middle. Some huts had improvised partitions for a hint of privacy, but most were just open bays. You lived shoulder to shoulder with 24 other men. You heard every snore, every cough, every nightmare. There was no privacy, but there was camaraderie, and the huts weren't just barracks. That's what made them so valuable. A Quonset hut could be anything. Some became mess halls, long tables set up in rows where hundreds of men filed through for chow. The smell of food, sweat, and metal mixing together in the humid air. Others became field hospitals, cots lined up like a factory floor, wounded men staring at the curved steel ceiling, wondering if they'd ever see home again. Nurses and doctors moving between the rows, trying to save lives in a building that was never meant to be a hospital, but became one anyway. Some huts were command centers, maps pinned to the walls, radio equipment humming, officers hunched over tables, planning operations by the light of kerosene lamps. And then there were the chapels. Maybe the strangest use of all. A crude wooden altar at one end, rows of folding chairs or benches, men with bowed heads, singing hymns or praying in silence, trying to find some piece of peace in a building designed for war. Soldiers adapted. They always do. They hung photos from home on nails driven into the plywood ends. They carved their names into the wood. They painted murals or pin-up girls on the interior walls. They turned these identical steel shells into something personal, something that felt a little bit like home, even though home was 10,000 miles away. Letters sent back to the States often mentioned the huts, some with humor. One guy from Texas wrote, "It's like living inside a giant soup can, but at least the soup can doesn't leak." But almost always, there was gratitude, because the Quonset Hut represented something. It meant that even in the most God-forsaken corner of the planet, America had found a way to bring structure, order, and shelter. Now, let's zoom out and look at the big picture. Because the Quonset Hut didn't just stay in one place, it went everywhere, and I mean everywhere. By 1943, you could find Quonset Huts on 6 continents, from the Aleutian Islands in Alaska to the deserts of North Africa, from the jungles of New Guinea to the farmlands of France. Wherever American forces landed, those curved steel roofs followed close behind. Let's start in the Pacific. This is where the huts really proved their worth. When Marines stormed ashore at Guadalcanal in August 1942, they weren't just fighting the Japanese. They were fighting the environment. Malaria-infested swamps, jungle so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead, rain that turned the ground into soup. But within weeks, Quonset Huts started arriving. Crates offloaded from cargo ships, assembly crews working around the clock, and suddenly the island started to transform. Airfields appeared with control towers made from huts, maintenance hangars, barracks for bomber crews, hospitals for the wounded. By the time the fighting moved north to Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, the pattern was set. Capture the island, secure the beachhead, start unloading huts. Within days, a bare rock in the ocean became a functioning military base. In Europe, the story was similar, but different. After D-Day in June 1944, Allied forces punched through Normandy and started pushing east. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, and all along those lines, Quonset Huts sprouted like mushrooms, field hospitals just behind the front lines, logistics depots stacked with supplies, repair shops for vehicles and aircraft. When winter hit during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, those huts became lifesavers, heated shelters where men could thaw out, dry their clothes, and get a few hours of sleep before heading back into the frozen hell of the Ardennes forest. German soldiers, freezing in their bunkers, must have looked at those American camps with envy. But perhaps the most extreme deployments were in places nobody thinks about. Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, hurricane-force winds, sub-zero temperatures, darkness for months at a time. And yet, Quonset Huts went up there too, anchored to the permafrost with steel cables. In North Africa, they faced the opposite problem. Blazing heat, sandstorms that could strip paint off metal. But the Quonset Hut's curved design actually helped. The arch reflected sunlight better than flat roofs. By 1945, the reach was staggering. There were Quonset Huts in Australia, supporting the Pacific Campaign. In India, serving as supply depots for the Burma Theatre. In the Philippines, rebuilt after liberation. Even in places like Iceland, Greenland, and the Azores. And it wasn't just Americans using them. British forces adopted them for their own bases. Australian troops set them up across the Southwest Pacific. The design was so universal, so effective, that it transcended national boundaries. Soldiers joked that you could tell where America had been by the steel half-moons dotting the landscape. They became symbols of American presence, as recognizable as the flag itself. The Quonset Hut wasn't just a building. It was the infrastructure of victory. And by the time the war ended, that infrastructure had literally circled the planet. August 1945. The war ends. Japan surrenders. And suddenly, the United States has a problem. What do you do with 100,000 steel huts scattered across the world? Most people assumed they'd just rust away, or get scrapped for metal. After all, they were supposed to be temporary, a wartime stopgap. But that's not what happened. Instead, the Quonset Hut began a second life, one that would reshape American society in unexpected ways. First, there was the immediate crisis at home. Millions of GIs were coming back, and they all needed places to live. The housing market couldn't keep up. Construction during the war had ground to a halt. Now you had entire cities bursting with veterans, many of them married and starting families, and nowhere near enough homes to go around. Enter the Quonset Hut. The government started selling surplus huts for dirt cheap. Universities bought them by the hundreds. Colleges that had been sleepy before the war suddenly had thousands of students thanks to the GI Bill. They needed housing, and they needed it yesterday. The University of Michigan built a complex called Vet Village, rows of huts converted into apartments for married students. Each one had a small kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom if you were lucky. Wives learned to cook in cylindrical kitchens with curved walls. Kids played in the yards between the steel shells. Other schools did the same. Minnesota, UCLA, Brown, hundreds of colleges across the country turned old military surplus into student housing. For a generation of veterans, the Quonset Hut followed them home from war. But it went beyond colleges. Entire neighborhoods sprouted Quonset Hut homes. Small towns bought surplus units and set them up as temporary housing developments. Families moved in, expecting to stay a year or two until something better came along. Some stayed for a decade. The huts also found new lives as businesses: diners, garages, workshops, storage facilities. Farmers loved them as barns and equipment sheds. Churches bought them and turned them into parish halls or even main sanctuaries. Dance halls, bowling alleys, even small factories. Overseas, the story was similar. In the Philippines, Guam, Okinawa, and other occupied territories, locals took over abandoned Quonset huts and turned them into homes, shops, schools. The buildings that America left behind became foundations for rebuilding. But living in a Quonset hut in peacetime came with challenges. They were never designed for permanent residential use. Insulation was poor. In summer, they baked. In winter, they froze. Condensation dripped from the curved ceilings. Families adapted. They added interior walls for privacy, installed better insulation, painted the exteriors, built front porches to make them feel more like homes. By the 1950s, most of the residential huts were being phased out. Suburbs were expanding. New construction was booming. Families moved on. But the huts that had been converted for other uses stuck around, and some are still there today. Drive across rural America, and you'll still see them, rusted but standing. Some used as storage sheds or workshops, others abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by nature. A few have been lovingly restored. The Quonset Hut was supposed to disappear after the war. But like the generation that fought in it, these buildings proved tougher than anyone expected. They adapted. They endured. So here we are, 80 years later. And the Quonset Hut still hasn't disappeared. You can find them if you know where to look. On old military bases that have been converted to other uses. On college campuses where a few stragglers remain. In industrial parks being used as warehouses. On farms serving as storage. Some are in terrible shape. Rust eating through the panels, roofs sagging, windows broken. But others have been restored, repainted, reinforced. A few communities have even designated them as historical landmarks. But the legacy goes beyond the physical structures. The Quonset Hut changed how we think about building. Before World War II, most construction was site-specific. You designed a building for a location, then built it there from scratch. The Quonset Hut proved you could design a building once, manufacture it in a factory, and assemble it anywhere. That concept, mass-produced prefabricated housing, became the foundation for an entire industry. Post-war architects looked at the success of the Quonset Hut and started asking questions. What if we applied this thinking to civilian housing? The prefab movement of the 50s and 60s traces its roots directly back to these wartime experiments. Today, when you see modular homes being trucked to construction sites in pieces, or flat-pack furniture from IKEA, or even shipping container architecture, you're seeing the descendants of that original idea. Build it in pieces, ship it flat, assemble on-site. Culturally, the huts left their mark too. For the generation that fought World War II, they became symbols. When veterans gathered to tell stories, the Quonset Hut was always in the background. The place where you wrote letters home, where you played cards with your squad, where you tried to sleep while artillery boomed in the distance. And maybe most importantly, they proved something about American capability. When the crisis hit, when millions needed shelter, and there was no time to waste, America didn't throw up its hands. It designed a solution, tooled up factories, and produced over 100,000 buildings in less than 4 years. The enemy could build fortifications, but America built cities. Instant, portable, scalable cities that could pop up anywhere. That's the kind of advantage that doesn't show up in casualty counts, but won the war just as surely as any weapon. In the 21st century, there's been a revival of interest. Architects looking at sustainable building have rediscovered the efficiency of the Quonset form. Steel is recyclable. The design is inherently strong. The simplicity means less waste. DIY builders have embraced them too. You can buy a Quonset kit online, have it delivered to your property, and assemble it yourself. The design hasn't changed much because it didn't need to. Good engineering is timeless, and every once in a while, when disaster strikes, hurricanes, earthquakes, refugee crises, someone suggests Quonset huts as emergency shelter. The same logic applies. We need housing now. We need it cheap. We need it to work in harsh conditions. Because here's the thing about legacy. It's not always loud. It's not always obvious. Sometimes legacy is just a curved piece of steel standing in a field, quietly doing its job for 80 years. So let's come back to where we started. That field full of Quonset huts stretching to the horizon. Picture it in black and white, the way war photographers captured it. Mud-churned roads between perfect rows of identical steel arcs. Jeeps parked in front. Soldiers moving between the structures like ants in a colony. Laundry hanging on lines strung between huts. Smoke rising from mess hall chimneys. This wasn't one location. This was dozens of locations. Hundreds. Every major base in the Pacific had a view like this at some point. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Okinawa. Each one looked the same. A sea of curved metal where jungle or sand had been just weeks before. And if you could have stood there in 1944, watching the sun set over those fields of steel, you would have been looking at something unprecedented in human history. An instant civilization, a portable empire. Proof that America could project not just military force, but entire infrastructure, anywhere on the planet. Think about what that meant to a soldier arriving fresh from the States. You'd been on a transport ship for weeks, cramped, seasick, scared about what was waiting for you. And then you arrive, and instead of tents and chaos, there's order. There are buildings, there are roads, there's a functioning base with everything you need to survive and fight. That psychological impact was real. Now think about what it meant to the enemy. Japanese commanders watching American forces land on an island knew they had a limited window to counterattack. But that window kept shrinking. Because within days, sometimes hours, the Americans weren't just dug in. They had infrastructure, air support, supply lines, all protected by those steel shells that rose faster than seemed possible. The Germans faced the same reality in Europe. They'd been told that American soldiers were soft, and then they watched Americans set up heated camps in the dead of winter, complete with hot food and dry beds, while German troops shivered in foxholes. But most importantly, think about what those fields of huts meant for the outcome of the war. Because here's the truth. World War II was won in factories before it was won on battlefields. It was won by the country that could produce more tanks, more. Maybe the lesson is about innovation. The Quonset Hut wasn't revolutionary technology. It was just steel and bolts and common sense. But it was applied brilliantly, at massive scale, when it mattered most. Sometimes the best innovation isn't inventing something new. It's taking something simple and making it work better than anyone thought possible. Or maybe the lesson is about resilience, about building things that last even when you're building them fast. The Quonset Hut survived war, peace, hurricanes, decades of neglect, and changing needs because the fundamental design was sound. But I think the real lesson is this. Pay attention to the things that don't get headlines, the infrastructure, the logistics, the unglamorous stuff that makes everything else possible. Because that's where wars are really won or lost. That's where civilizations rise or fall. The Quonset Hut is a reminder that sometimes the most important things are the ones we barely notice. The roof over your head, the floor under your feet, the walls that keep the chaos out. Simple things, essential things. But when they're not there, when soldiers are dying of exposure because there's nowhere to sleep, when entire campaigns stall because there's no infrastructure, that's when you realize how much those boring, unglamorous things actually matter. So the next time you drive past an old Quonset Hut, stop for a second. Look at it. Really look at it. That curved piece of corrugated steel is a monument to the thousands of people who solved an impossible problem when the world needed it most, to the engineers who designed it, the factory workers who built it, the soldiers who lived in it. It's a reminder of what America was capable of when everything was on the line, when there was no time for excuses, when the challenge was clear and the response had to be total. The Quonset Hut isn't pretty. It was never meant to be. It's just a half cylinder of steel bolted together in sections. But it worked. It worked so well that 80 years later, some are still standing, still serving. And maybe that's the most American thing about it. It's practical. It's efficient. It doesn't demand attention. It just works. That field of Quonset Huts we pictured at the beginning, it's not there anymore. The jungle reclaimed most of those islands. The huts were dismantled or left to rust. The soldiers who lived in them are mostly gone. But the legacy remains. It proved that you don't need to be flashy to be important. You don't need to be complicated to be effective. You just need to work when it counts. And when it counted most, when the free world was hanging in the balance, that curved steel shell did its job, over and over, in every climate, on every continent, for millions of men who needed a roof and found one waiting in a crate. So here's to the Quonset Hut, the building nobody remembers, the weapon nobody talks about. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic, but it was exactly what the world needed, exactly when it needed it. The Quonset Hut did all three, and some are still out there, standing in fields, rusting but stubborn, refusing to fall. Still doing their job, still standing as quiet monuments to the generation that built them. That curved piece of steel changed the world, and if you look closely, you can still see the evidence. In old photographs of Pacific islands transformed into cities of steel, in surplus huts converted into homes, in the prefab buildings we use today. The war ended 80 years ago, but the steel endures.